Really briefly, just in case you don't know who I am, I always presume that. My name is Rick O'Shea. I'm a broadcaster. I've been the patron of Epilepsy Ireland for the last years. I forget at this point, 8, I think. And I've had epilepsy since I was 16. The language of epilepsy thing was really easy. I think language alters attitudes constantly in life, not just in epilepsy, not just in medical terminology, but constantly in life. For instance, if I said to you, this lady right here is a banker, immediately your attitude towards her has changed. I'm hoping you're not a banker, are you? You're not. Definitely not. Okay, that's fine. In which case, then you wouldn't have been allowed to continue. But it has. It altered your attitude towards her the moment I told you she was a banker. It can be that way with so many other terms in life as well. You know, even if I said somebody was a feminist, that immediately leads you to believe something on one side or the other of that equation. It alters your opinion of them ever so slightly, whether you are a feminist or not, because that terminology even now is changing as well. If I told you somebody was a Kilkenny hurler, again, your opinion towards that person has automatically changed, either towards them being the greatest person in the world or somebody who has thwarted your county's dreams for many years now. So language alters people's attitudes constantly in life, and sometimes it's just a simple word. I mean, in medical terminology, it's easy. Nut job is a phrase that obviously isn't and can't be used about somebody. It's prejudicial terminology that's now long since gone out. Words that existed for decades and sometimes centuries and that were considered perfectly acceptable, handicapped, referring to somebody as a spastic. These words are long since gone. They've been washed out with, the modern age and with the 21st century, and mostly with the 20th century for a lot of them. And I think that whilst it's not exactly the same with the terminology of epilepsy, that we do have words and sometimes terms that are things that need to be moved on from. I was even thinking the other day actually about how words can be used to be prejudicial towards somebody or change them. When you're kids, fatty, 4 eyes, crater face. I'm just talking about my own childhood and not everybody else's necessarily. But words can be used like that to define somebody as something. And I think in particular with the word epileptic, which I know is a divisive word amongst all of us. Some people think it's absolutely fine and they've no problem with it. Some people choose never to use it and instead will always refer to themselves as having epilepsy or that somebody else has epilepsy. The weird thing about being the patron of the organisation, and particularly once people start to get to know your face, and not a lot of people know my face because obviously I'm on radio for a living, but once they realise that you are who you are and what you do for Epilepsy Ireland, I've said this many times before, but you become like a little lightning rod for people's stories. And anytime you're out in places, people come up to you simply to go, "Hi, I have epilepsy," and they have a conversation with you about it. It happened to me the other night. I was doing an event in town, which was entirely unconnected to this. It was a podcast about privacy. And at the very end of it, a girl comes up and she says, "Hi, how are you? Listen, I know who you are, and I have epilepsy as well. I'm just starting radio studies in Ballyfermot. She wants to have a conversation with me about it." But mostly the thrust of her conversation was she wanted me to say to her, "This doesn't have to define my life, does it?" And I said to her, "Well, all I can do is tell you my story and say that I've managed to do pretty much everything that I've wanted to do in my life, shy of winning the lottery, which I'm still working on, and has nothing to do with whether or not I have epilepsy. And that having epilepsy and managing to get it controlled means that that isn't what defines me as a person." The word epileptic, I think in particular, sometimes does, because that's a word of definition. It's something that marks you out as that. If you had a word cloud of words about somebody's life, take me, Liverpool supporter for my sins, somebody who's from Dublin, speaks for a living, likes music, goes to the theatre. If the defining thing about you is the word epileptic, then that's not necessarily real or true in terms of my life. I remember I did a thing again for the organisation many moons ago with a tabloid newspaper that I won't name, the Daily Mail, and they interviewed me about my story since I was 16 and having the condition. They wrote up the article in the first person as if I had written the article myself, and in it I referred to myself as being epileptic on more than one occasion, and I opened the newspaper and just went, "Oh God, not that word." It's that word of definition. It's something that I think has defined people with epilepsy for too long. I think we've now managed to change attitudes. I think it's happening very slowly, but I think that's why it's something that should be paid attention to and adhered to in terms of how language shapes attitudes towards us. I mean, we've come along in leaps and bounds really over the course of the last even 10 years in terms of people understanding the way they should have conversations about people who have epilepsy and when they have seizures or when they have whatever. When I became the patron for the first time, one of the first conversations that was had with me, because I'd be speaking about it publicly and because I only really knew about my own epilepsy, I didn't really know about the condition as a whole. We had whole discussions about numbers, stats, figures, numbers of people, but then we had the one about terminology, and terminology was a crucial one. And it was something that was spoken to me about at the time. I'd never really thought about it before, and I've adhered to it ever since then. I think to suggest that language doesn't shape people's attitudes is a nonsense, because it shapes attitudes in life, and there's no reason as to why in epilepsy it should be any different. And that's pretty much all I have for you. Thank you.
I do find it kind of ironic that out of all of the times I've ever spoken at any Epilepsy Ireland event, this was the one I was in a way most nervous about, because I was so afraid of offending people. I mean, which happens anyway, because I'm not the most appropriate of speakers generally, but I think it's really funny that in a room full of people who either have epilepsy or know someone with epilepsy, that I'm scared of offending you, and clearly I'm not going to be the type of person to be prejudiced against people with epilepsy, also having had it myself since I was 16. And on the speaking out loud thing and debating, there was no debating championship won, and I would point out that while we both speak for a living, myself and Rick, he's the only one actually earning a living from doing what he does. So I think I should set that out at the get-go. But despite all the nerves about it and who I'm pitted against, I'm actually quite excited about this in a way, like Rick as well, because it's something I feel quite strongly about, and from the get-go when I was diagnosed, always felt that attitudes towards epilepsy were something that I allowed not to be controlled by language. So I apologise in advance if I say any offensive words. I hope I don't. I'm going to try and avoid that. I think my attitude to this can be distilled into 2 points, because that's what debaters do. The first is that I don't believe that language shapes attitudes. I think attitudes shape attitudes, and that's something that the person with epilepsy controls, not the language. And secondly, I go further and say that there's a real tangible harm to imposing limits on the conversations that we have about epilepsy, that there's a harm to limiting the language that we can use, that it impinges the conversation and the discourse, which is, at the end of the day, what we're all trying to encourage: an open discourse about epilepsy, to normalise epilepsy, to help people understand what epilepsy is, and ultimately to make sure that people with epilepsy are safe. So attitudes shaping attitudes. I'll give a little bit of the story, I suppose, which led me to hold that belief, which was when I was first diagnosed. I went straight for the coma, because not to do one thing, things by halves. I ended up in hospital with my seizures not stopping. And so when I finally came round, and it took a while because I was on a lot of drugs, legal ones that were prescribed. My mum took quite a while to explain to me what had happened. You can understand waking up in intensive care, you're a little bit all over the place. And when it finally sunk in, okay, I've been diagnosed with epilepsy, this is what this is, I was obviously extremely upset, but I said to my mum, I said, God, I'm never going to be able to do stuff again now. That's it, that's my life kind of ruined, I'll never be able to play basketball like I do, or dance, or anything. And she, I think, then called me a drama queen, which gives you some indication of the attitude that my family took to my epilepsy. And hi, Mom. From that moment on, my whole family took the view that if you were to hold yourself back, that there was no point in having survived the coma in the first place. And one of the ways in which we normalised epilepsy for me and just took it on board as one of those things that I have, the same way I've got a loud mouth and a tendency to rap when I have a couple of drinks in me, that we would speak about it normally. That was the attitude of my family. And I can't probably say the things that we've all said amongst ourselves, or the way I speak about my epilepsy with my friends. That's one of those things I'm going to avoid when I'm speaking out loud in public. But certainly they're far from PC. Epileptic, the word epileptic, or even the word fit, again, that's on the more appropriate side of how I would speak about my epilepsy, which gives you some idea. And I think ultimately that's been a hugely beneficial thing for me. because going back into school after the, I think, 2 weeks I was off after I landed in hospital was a kind of make or break time in terms of how I was going to introduce the idea to my friends that, look, I have this condition, I might have a seizure at some point or another. If I do, here's what you do. To the point where my emergency medication now is buccal midazolam, the one that you put in both your cheeks. At the time, it was rectal diazepam. So you can imagine the conversation I had to have with my group of friends who, in fairness to them, were extremely supportive and strangely eager to help me out. So my attitude of speaking about it quite normally, not correcting someone if they say fit or epileptic, I think made them feel a lot more comfortable with my epilepsy. And ultimately, when someone feels more comfortable with the epilepsy, not only is it easier for you just on a daily basis to have conversations with people or to talk about something that does affect your life, and to a certain extent it does define you, I don't shy away from that, but it also keeps you safe. And that's a major thing. If I felt in any way inhibited talking about my epilepsy, or if my friends or colleagues around me felt awkward about it because they think, oh God, I don't want to offend her by saying the wrong word, you then don't have that conversation about what to do if you do have a seizure. And again, I keep having to stop myself from saying the word that I use. But you know, you don't get to have that conversation, and ultimately, I think you're kept safer if you're able to be more open about it. And I think what Rick said about the word epileptic defining you, I think firstly, as I said just there a couple of seconds ago, it's not the worst thing in the world if something defines you. I'm blonde, that defines me. I'm chatty, that defines me. I have epilepsy, to a certain extent that defines me. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just something you have. It's a trait, it's a condition, and it should be, you know, embraced and with life gotten on with. But even aside from that, if you don't accept that, I think you're giving words far too much weight, when really the power is with the person with epilepsy to shape attitudes. It's not the language that they use, it's how they talk about it and how they speak on behalf of themselves and how they interact with others, and how, in the case of the people here, they speak on behalf of people with epilepsy. For example, you see Joe Schmidt on the Late Late talking about normalizing epilepsy, and again, that's something that's kept his son quite safe, having that open conversation. And I think to shy away from using words or to step over yourself or to be hesitant kind of detracts from that. And I think it impinges on a conversation that needs to be had about epilepsy if we're to normalise it, and if we're to, you know, get funding even that we need, or publicity that we need for Epilepsy Ireland. So moving on to the harm that I think comes with it, and it carries on from what I said there about stifling discourse. I think using terminology, or specifically correcting people on their terminology, poses a barrier to understanding the condition, especially with medical terminology. You know, some people are just used to calling it fit and don't think of it in an offensive way. I mean, if someone says, God, you're one throwing a fit, as opposed to, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize you had a fit. There's a massive difference there, and the language isn't shaping that, it's the attitude of the person. I think that's anything that needs to be changed. It's not the language itself being used. And I think it can sometimes alienate an audience that we need to reach if we're being stick in the muds about the terminology that we use. I'll give an example of an embarrassing story, because sure, what would one be without it? And it's just to show, I suppose, how ignorance can be harmful, but also hilarious and make for good anecdotes and speeches. There was a boy I'd started to see. This is back when I was 19. My mother's hiding her face in her hands. This is a really good anecdote. I'll end on this. And we'd only just started going out, and we were sitting, I think, actually in a debating chamber, because that's what I did with my life. And he was sitting to the right of me, and I had two friends sitting to the left, and I was actually talking to them, and I can't remember what we were talking about, but it was something to do with epilepsy, and I said, yeah, what with it being contagious? And I turned around, and his face, if I'd had a camera, I mean, it was just priceless. It was just ashen. And I kind of thought, okay, two things, again, 2 points. Firstly, are you that stupid? And then I'm thinking, my decisions are bad. And secondly, do you think I would be that careless to start going out with you and then mention a couple of weeks in, you might have a touch of the epilepsy, just a touch. And it's because he'd never had that conversation, you know, and he felt awkward talking about it, because any conversation he'd had up to that point about epilepsy wasn't using the words that I was, or wasn't quite so blasé about it as I was. So it's a small and kind of flippant example of how I think actually when you're more open with your language and when you care less about terminology, that you encourage an open discourse and you help keep yourself safe. So I think it's really important actually that we embrace all the words so long as they're meant in the right way, which in my experience, they usually are. Thank you very much.